Step away from the bench now. Drop the object. The sharp command shattered the morning stillness at the corner of Alder and 17th. Officer Dylan Mercer, young and tightly wound, stood with one hand on his taser, the other pointing straight at a 93-year-old man seated quietly beneath the shelter of the bus stop. The man didn't move. He simply looked up, eyes calm but tired hands resting atop a polished wooden cane. He wore a faded bomber jacket, pressed slacks, and a wool cap stitched with a fraying emblem few recognized anymore, the symbol of the 8th Air Force. His name was Leonard Len Miller, and the object in his hand wasn't a weapon. It was a cane, a tool he needed to stand, to walk, to live with dignity after a lifetime of sacrifice. But Officer Mercer didn't see that. What he saw was a silhouette, an unresponsive figure in a shaky neighborhood, a potential threat. Mercer had been told to treat hesitation as resistance caution, as guilt and unfamiliar faces as danger. And this frail old man wasn't moving fast enough. Last warning. Mercer shouted, eyes scanning the area as a few bystanders reached for their phones. One mother stepped in front of her toddler's stroller. Another man began recording silently from behind a parked car. Len shifted, trying to stand with care. His knees buckled slightly under him. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said gently, voice lined with gravel and grace. "I'm just waiting for my ride to the VA. That's all." But Mercer didn't hear the words, only saw the slow movement, the cane, the silence. And then the trigger was pulled. A crackling buzz, a flash of wires, and Len crumpled to the sidewalk, his cane falling with a hollow clatter. Gasps erupted. Someone screamed. 6 minutes later, the block was swarmed with sirens. But before that, before the electricity and panic and headlines, Leonard Miller had simply come to sit in peace. Every Tuesday for years, he caught the 8:40 a.m. bus to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center for his physical therapy sessions. The arthritis in his spine had worsened over time, the VA helping him manage what decades of duty had carved into his bones. He was one of the last of his crew, a B-17 bomber pilot who had flown 36 missions over Nazi Germany. The Distinguished Flying Cross still hung from his neck beneath his sweater, a quiet reminder of courage long past. But on this morning, all of that, his record, his sacrifice, his humanity, meant nothing. To Officer Mercer, Leonard Miller was just an old man with a cane, and for the moment, that was enough to be seen as a threat. The paramedics moved quickly. Leonard Len Miller, 93 years old and barely conscious, lay on the sidewalk, his breathing shallow. As they stabilized him, one of them, EMT Clara Vasquez, noticed something unusual clipped inside his wallet. It was a tattered but laminated ID card from the Department of Defense marked Special Status, WWII Veteran, Distinguished Flying Cross. Her brow furrowed. "Wait," she murmured, kneeling closer. "This guy's not just a veteran, he's under federal protection." Her partner glanced over. "You sure?" Clara nodded. "I've seen one of these before. We need to notify his contact immediately." She flipped the card over. Printed in bold, emergency contact. Colonel Rachel Kim, Pentagon, Liaison Office. Without hesitation, Clara grabbed her secure hospital tablet and submitted an emergency alert through the DoD Veterans Network. What happened next would change the day, the city, and the country. Colonel Rachel Kim was deep in a briefing at the Pentagon when her encrypted line lit up, read a Priority 1 alert. She tapped the earpiece. "Go for Kim. This is Mercy General. We've just admitted Leonard Miller. He was injured during a police encounter involving a taser deployment." Rachel froze. "Leonard Miller, the bomber pilot from the 303rd Bomb Group." "Yes, ma'am. He's conscious, but barely. The incident occurred while he waited at a bus stop for a VA appointment." Local police young officer mistook him for a threat. For a moment there was silence. Then Colonel Kim stood already striding out of the briefing room, mobilized the protocol, all of it. Within 2 minutes, a secure message had been sent to the Secretary of Defense, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and the Department of Justice. Within 6, 2 black Suburbans screeched away from Joint Base Andrews, carrying FBI Special Agent Eli Navarro and 3 federal investigators toward the hospital. Simultaneously, a second convoy marked only by federal plates and dark-tinted windows descended on the precinct where Officer Dylan Mercer was still fumbling through his incident report. The young officer had expected to be praised for decisive action. Instead, he was ushered into an interrogation room by a stone-faced sergeant and told to wait. The air was cold, the silence louder than any siren. At the hospital, Colonel Kim arrived in full service dress, her chest lined with ribbons earned over decades of duty. She moved through the ER with quiet urgency until she reached the curtain around Len's bed. She paused, collecting herself, then stepped through. Len lay propped up, an IV in his arm, his breathing steadier but labored. His eyes opened slowly when he heard her voice. "Colonel Kim," he rasped. "I didn't think I'd ever hear your voice again." She smiled softly and took his hand. "You weren't supposed to need me, Len, but here we are." "I was just waiting for my ride," he muttered, trying to laugh. "Didn't know that was a crime now. You did nothing wrong, and we're going to make sure the entire country knows it." Outside the room, reporters began gathering at the hospital entrance. News of the tasing had gone viral, with clips already dominating every major network and social media feed. The footage, grainy, shaky, but damning, showed Officer Mercer shouting, Len pleading, and then the sharp crackle of electricity. The hashtags began trending immediately. Justice for Len, shash, elderly, abuse, veteran tased. But what turned a viral video into a full-blown federal emergency was the identity of the man who fell Leonard Miller, a national treasure, whose wartime record had been studied in military academies. Back at the precinct, Special Agent Navarro and his team stepped inside the chief's office, presenting a federal subpoena and an internal review notice. "We are initiating a federal investigation under the Civil Rights Protection Act," Navarro announced. "You had an officer deploy a taser on a 93-year-old man who holds a distinguished flying cross. That places this incident under military veteran protection jurisdiction." Chief Harlan, red-faced and tight-lipped, tried to protest. It was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Navarro didn't flinch. Mistakes don't get a man tased for carrying a cane. Officer Mercer was placed on immediate administrative leave pending federal charges. His uniform was taken, his badge suspended. He sat in silence as federal agents combed through his body cam footage, his training records, and his prior conduct reports, some of which had already shown troubling signs. Meanwhile, Colonel Kim convened a press briefing outside the hospital. "Leonard Miller is not just a veteran," she said, flanked by Department of Defense officials. "He is a symbol of service, sacrifice, and dignity. What happened today is unacceptable. The federal government is launching a full investigation, and I promise you we will not let this stand." The statement was carried live on every major network. Military veterans began speaking out in solidarity. A group of WWII historians circulated a petition. Congressional representatives called for immediate hearings. Inside room 214, Len quietly adjusted his pillow. The chaos outside muffled behind closed doors. He turned to Colonel Kim. "Rachel, do they really care?" She nodded gently. "They do now." The early evening light filtered through the hospital blinds when the convoy pulled up. Secret Service agents fanned out before the double-glass doors, their arrival swift and silent. Inside Len Miller's hospital room, there was no pomp, only a quiet dignity. Nurses stood respectfully along the walls, and Len, though still bruised and bandaged from the taser shock, had insisted on sitting upright, brushing his white hair back into a clean part. A knock followed by a soft but firm voice. "Mr. Leonard Miller, the President of the United States." James Whitaker stepped inside. Gasps from staff. The hum of television cameras rolling live from the hallway. The moment had arrived. "Sir," the president began, removing his suit jacket and stepping forward with deliberate humility. "I'm here not just as president, but as an American who owes you a debt we can never repay." Len looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. "You didn't tase me, son," he said with a faint smile. The president chuckled gently, but his voice held weight. "No, I didn't. But I lead a nation where that happened, and that's enough to carry responsibility." He lowered himself into the chair beside Len's bed and took the veteran's frail hand. "On behalf of the United States of America, I am deeply sorry for what happened to you, and for every moment you were treated as less than the hero you are." The cameras caught it all, the sincerity, the reverence, the humility. News anchors across the country paused mid-segment as the live footage aired, millions watching as one of the last surviving World War II bomber pilots received the apology he never expected. Len nodded slowly, emotion in his throat, but steadiness in his tone. "Mr. President, I appreciate that, but I don't want this to become a story of punishment. That young officer, he made a mistake, yes, but this shouldn't be about vengeance." The president blinked. "What would you want it to be about, sir?" Understanding, Len said. Compassion, training. If this helps just one officer learn how to speak to someone like me, someone slow on his feet, but not dangerous, then it was worth it. I've survived worse. President Whitaker sat back, visibly moved. You've endured more than most could imagine, and even now you're teaching us how to lead. He turned to the press. This is not just a moment of apology, it is a turning point. He stood facing the cameras. Today I am signing an executive order establishing the Leonard Miller Veterans Protection Act. This legislation will mandate nationwide law enforcement training on how to properly identify, respect, and de-escalate interactions with elderly and disabled veterans. We will create a centralized database of federally protected veteran profiles to prevent misidentification. And every police academy receiving federal funds will implement new curriculum starting immediately. Gasps echoed down the hallway. Aides exchanged wide-eyed looks. The measure had been hinted at behind closed doors, but no one expected its announcement here, live, spontaneous, standing beside a 93-year-old man in a hospital bed. Len sat quietly, absorbing the weight of the moment. Then he spoke again, soft but firm. Let's not forget what this really means. There are others out there like me, quiet, sitting on benches waiting for buses. They're not looking for recognition, but they sure don't deserve fear. The president looked at him with admiration. You're right, Mr. Miller. They deserve our gratitude and our protection. As the press event concluded, a young staffer stepped forward to place a small box in Len's lap. Inside it rested the newly cast Presidential Citizens Medal. For valor, the president said, in war and peace. Len lifted it slowly, turning it over in his hands. I'll put this next to the one they gave me in '44. Might look good side by side. Outside the hospital, people gathered, holding American flags and signs that read, "We stand with Len." Veterans saluted, civilians wept. A bus driver who'd driven Len to appointments for years held a sign reading, "I always knew who he was." But inside, Len asked for just one thing. "Sir," he said, "could I be left alone for a moment?" The president nodded. Everyone exited quietly. Alone again, Len looked out the hospital window at the city below. The same world that had once turned its back now stood still, listening. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and whispered, "Maybe now they finally see me." The sentencing of Officer Dylan Mercer came with little surprise, but it carried a weight the nation hadn't felt in decades. Inside a packed federal courtroom with veterans seated shoulder to shoulder in dress blues and battered caps. The young officer stood before the judge, pale and withdrawn. When the guilty verdict was read, civil rights violations, excessive use of force, and aggravated assault against a federally protected individual, the room remained silent, not out of vengeance, but solemn reflection. Leonard Len Miller was not present in the courtroom that day. He had chosen to remain at home, recovering, surrounded by family and comrades. But his voice had already echoed through every corner of the justice system. He had made it clear accountability mattered, but so did healing. "Let justice teach, not destroy," he had said in a statement read aloud during sentencing. May no other officer make this mistake again. And may no veteran ever again have to fear a badge instead of trust it. Officer Mercer was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, 2 of which would be served with a mandatory rehabilitation program focusing on de-escalation bias, recognition, and veteran trauma education. The decision was historic, not because of the length of the sentence, but because of the conditions tied to it. The court's ruling marked the first time such a rehabilitation clause had been federally mandated in a case involving law enforcement and a veteran. But justice didn't end at sentencing. The Leonard Miller Veterans Protection Act, signed by President James Whitaker just 2 weeks earlier, had gone into full effect. Federal funding to state and local police departments was now contingent on participation in mandatory veteran sensitivity training. Departments across all 50 states were required to implement a curriculum built in collaboration with the Department of Veterans Affairs, military psychologists, and veteran advocates. Police academies added new modules, understanding post-traumatic stress in older populations, the physical limitations of aging veterans, and recognizing key medical identifiers like VA ID cards and military service pins. Officers were now required to complete biannual de-escalation simulations involving elderly or disabled individuals, a reform Len had insisted on personally. "It's not about turning cops into social workers," he had said. "It's about making sure they don't turn citizens into statistics." Len's story was also added to national law enforcement training materials. The footage of the bus stop incident, edited respectfully, was now shown to new recruits as a lesson in the devastating consequences of assumption and haste. Side by side with it played clips of Len's hospital speech, his calm urging for understanding, and his refusal to condemn without reflection. By the time summer arrived, the impact could be felt everywhere. In Phoenix, a patrol unit helped a Korean war vet navigate a crowded sidewalk with a new walker. In Boston, an officer paused to salute an elderly man wearing a faded Navy cap before helping him cross the street. In Chicago, a precinct held its first Veteran Awareness Day, where officers shared meals and stories with local vets in a community park. And in Len's hometown, his old VA hospital had a new mural. Painted across the lobby wall were the words, "Respect earned, dignity required." Beside it, a framed photograph of Len in uniform during World War II, and another taken the day President Whitaker placed the Presidential Citizens Medal around his neck. That ceremony, held on the White House lawn, was a moment that transcended politics or publicity. The president had introduced him as a man who turned pain into purpose and who met injustice not with rage, but with resolve. Len had responded with a humble nod and his signature half-smile. "I'm no hero," he said to the cameras, "but I know what one looks like. I've served beside them, and I believe this country still knows how to honor its own. I'm just grateful to see it happen while I'm still around." Veterans groups began citing Len's case as a turning point in national discourse. Military organizations invited him to speak virtually and in person at events commemorating service and sacrifice. Families of elderly veterans reached out sharing stories of kindness or heartbreak, saying, "Now we know we're not invisible." And still, every Tuesday and Thursday, Len returned to the bus stop. Same routine, same time. But everything had changed. Bus drivers tipped their hats. Young officers nodded with quiet respect. Strangers offered him their seats without hesitation. Len never asked for any of it, but he accepted it with grace. What surprised him most wasn't the recognition. It was the hope that something good could grow from something so wrong. One morning, a young cadet approached him as he waited for the bus. The trainee looked barely old enough to shave nervous in his crisp uniform. "Sir," he said, "I just finished my first veteran de-escalation module. We studied your case. They told us to remember your name." Len smiled, gently extending a hand. "Then you already passed the most important test." They shook hands. Later that day, Len sat on the bench beneath the mural at the VA, watching the world go by. He still carried his cane. He still bore the scars inside and out. But now, everywhere he looked, he saw signs of change, not flashy, not loud, but lasting. The kind of change that only begins when one man is finally seen, not as a threat, not as a burden, but as a life worth protecting. And Leonard Miller, once tased for waiting quietly at a bus stop, had become a symbol not of anger, but of honor restored. Months after the sentencing of Officer Mercer and the sweeping implementation of the Leonard Miller Veterans Protection Act, Len's role in the country's transformation only deepened. Fully recovered, both physically and emotionally. Leonard Len Miller embraced a new mission, not one of war, but of wisdom. At 93, Len became a quiet but powerful force in police academies and community forums. He stood in front of rows of cadets barely a third his age and began each session the same way, by setting down his cane, straightening his back, and saying, "Before you put on that badge, I want you to remember that every elderly person you meet has lived longer than you've been alive. Every wrinkle is a chapter, every pause a reason. Ask before you assume." His speeches didn't rage, they resonated. He didn't blame, he taught. And because of that, people listened. Len traveled to 17 states, speaking at events hosted by veteran organizations, civic leaders, and police departments seeking change. In every room, he carried the same message, that dignity is not something given, it's something recognized. He recounted not just the day he was tased, but the day afterward, when the nation chose to see him differently, not as a problem, but as a person. And that choice, he reminded them, is always available. One rainy Thursday, as Len sat once again at his usual bus stop, a young boy and his father approached. The boy held a handmade thank you card. "Are you the man from the video?" he asked. Len smiled. "That depends," he replied with a wink. "Is the man in the video someone you learned something from?" The boy nodded, and Len placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then yes, that's me." By the end of that year, Len had become more than a survivor. He was a teacher, a bridge between generations, and a living testament to the power of being heard. He never sought fame. He simply chose not to be forgotten. Sometimes the greatest change comes not from power, but from patience, from listening instead of shouting. Leonard Miller's story teaches us that even the quietest lives can shape a nation when we choose to see, hear, and honor them. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. I choose to see. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that remind us what dignity, courage, and humanity really mean.